Before you get listening, I just wanted to let you know that suicide is discussed around the 40-minute mark of this episode. If you're having suicidal thoughts, please reach out to the National Suicide Hotline at 988. The Trevor Project also has a helpful number for those in the LGBTQ community who may be experiencing a crisis. That number is 1-866-488-7386. Welcome back to the exfostervoice, where we represent the voices of those who have lived through the foster system. I'm Serena Vasudeva, ex-foster youth and your host. Today we'll be hearing from Melissa Nelson, who was adopted at birth. After getting her master's in social work, she went on to work for CASA. Before we get into this episode, I'd like you to know that Melissa is in Kentucky, where CPS handles foster care instead of DCS. So when your mom got pregnant at 14, what happened?
When she got pregnant at 14, her mother essentially kicked her out and she was placed in a unwed teenage mother home. It's something that I'm not really familiar with. It's something that doesn't really exist now or that I know about. So it was an interesting thing to find out about. But essentially she went into kind of a foster home for this unwed pregnant mothers. The whole process was kind of like, if she gave me up for adoption, she would be able to return home. And then she didn't really know, I guess, what would happen to her if she kept me. And so, she had to weigh her options, which is a tough decision for a 14-year-old to make, on her own. And so she made that decision, and it wasn't an easy decision to make. But I'm very thankful that she made the decision to give me up for adoption.
So tell me a bit about the organization that connected you to your adoptive parents, One Church, One Child.
So, One Church, One Child was a really interesting adoption agency. They were an all Black adoption agency that looked to put Black children with Black families. They wanted to make sure that children that were going into the foster care system, and especially during the 1980s, there weren't a lot of white families that wanted Black or brown babies. And so One Church, One Child was an agency that developed because they wanted to find homes or placements for these children so that they wouldn't have to go into care or into facilities, and had loving homes for them. I think my family found them through church. They are a very religious Christian family, and so they got connected through that. And once I was adopted, we kind of became part of the One Church, One Child family.
Tell me about how your biological mom met your adoptive parents.
So, One Church, One Child, the adoption agency, made the connection between my birth mother and my adoptive mother. I guess being in Lexington, and she was a young Black girl, they connected her with this agency. And so they started to find foster homes or adoptive homes once she decided that she wanted to adopt. And so I believe her name was Judy Jones. She was the director of the program at the time. And she kind of asked if she wanted to kind of meet them. Or at least this is what I've been told. My mom said, they went to Lexington and they kind of had this meeting with her. It was very brief, and they didn't really remember much about her, but they met her very briefly. She seemed really nice, and then, they came back home. And then that was kind of it. They didn't hear any more, didn't hear anything else. So they had kind of put it on the back burner until they got a call in November that a baby was being born and they had been chosen.
Tell me a bit about how your parents told you you were adopted.
So I don't remember how old I was, but I remember being very little. And the way that they explained it to me, like thinking back now, it was just a very beautiful way to explain it. Essentially, it was that they were given the opportunity to choose a baby, which was different than how other parents had their babies. And so in my mind, I saw it as they went to a store and they got to see like babies. So you go to the store and you see like doll babies on the shelf. And so you pick out the one that you like, right? And so in my mind, that's what they kind of did. They went to like a store, a baby store. And they picked out the baby that they, thought was pretty or that they liked the best. And so they chose that baby to provide love and care. So of course that's not what they said. They just said that they chose the baby that they wanted to love and provide care for the rest of their lives. And so they brought that baby home, and that baby was me. I always kept that image with me of like me just being in like a store, kind of packaged up all nice and pretty, looking at them and them looking at me and them reaching down and be like, we want that one. And I don't know, like I had like an image of like, okay, that'll be like $9.99. I don't know how much a baby costs, but I'm like, I'm sure it had some cost. Um, I remember asking them, so can you return me? And they were like, oh no, baby, we can't return you. We'll never return you. We love you. You're ours for the rest of your life. Like you're ours forever. And I'm like, okay. But that always kind of stuck in my head. I'm like, everybody doesn't get to choose their baby. That makes me special.
You had to guess. How old were you when you were told you were adopted?
It had to be probably before I was 4.
Would you say that most adoptive parents should do this, that they should tell their child if they are very young that they are adopted?
So my parents and I have talked about this quite a bit because they were unsure if that was the right thing to do. But in my mind, it was. I would definitely suggest telling your child early on. I've known people that did not know and found out later, and the heartbreak that they felt, they just really felt betrayed. I mean, to find out that the people that you thought were biologically yours are not the people that are biologically yours. And it really shouldn't matter, because they are still your parents. But it's just like an added layer of like, you hid something from me. I'm just really glad that I was never put in that situation. So I've always appreciated how honest my parents have been. And I think it is just something that has kind of pulled us together and not really pulled us apart. I think, with the exception of maybe teenage years, when I think every teenage child is going through something and looking for something. And I will say, like, my teenage years, not necessarily that I was looking for like different parents. I was mostly looking for someone who looked like me. It was hard for me to see, myself and my parents. I wanted to see, where I got my eyes from or my nose from, just kind of wondering like those things. And I think it really sparked from like 7th grade. We were doing like genetics, right? And so I think from that point, I was like, well, genetically, where do I come from? Where does this come from? Like, I'm supposed to get genes from somewhere. And I'm not getting it from these people. So then where does this come from? But now, like, as an adult, I actually look, and especially since I've found my like biological parents, when I look at my adoptive parents, I actually look like them. I look like my adoptive family.
Overall, you would say, though, that those questions that you had in your teenage years didn't outweigh the benefit that you got.
Absolutely not. I mean, even when we struggled and I wasn't as close, and I would say like my struggle was probably more with my mother, which I think is common between teenage girls anyway. You kind of go through that period where you're figuring yourself out and you're growing, right? I never once questioned whether they loved me, whether they wanted me, or whether I belonged there. It was more of a physical thing for me back then. And I think, especially as I got older, those questions really did go away. The crazy thing about it is, I really do look more like them than anything. And like now that I have children, my children have physical qualities of them. Like I could put up a side by side picture. Like I have twin sons, and one of them has like my dad's birthmark. It's crazy. Like it's crazy. My daughter looks a lot like my mom. There are a lot of things that have come out like now that I see, and it's weird.
The birthmark thing is kind of crazy. That's sick.
Hmm.
So when you were young, you started volunteering for One Church, One Child. Tell me
Hmm.
about it.
The very first thing we did for the agency, or I don't even know if it was for the agency or if it was for my mom's job, they did like a newsletter article at her job to talk about the agency and our adoption, and they put us on the cover of it. So there's like a picture of me and like my dad holding me, and I'm like pointing at him. It was just really cute. And then like after that, we would just kind of go around to like their events, and people would talk to us and ask us about like our experience. A lot of it was, especially when I was younger, how do you like it? Do you love your parents? And then as I got older, they would ask me to give speeches. And so I would stand up there and talk about my experience as an adopted child and my family. I would go to different events at churches or I guess like conferences and just talk about like what that was like. And so it was always like a good thing for me. Like I didn't ever feel like I was just being put on display or exploited, but it was like always something that I felt proud to do. I felt good to give back to this agency that helped me.
You met other people who were in foster care and had been adopted through this organization, correct?
Yes. They would be at these events frequently as well. They wouldn't always get the opportunity to kind of speak or do things, but they would usually be at the events and we would always kind of hang out. So we would spend a lot of time.
How did that affect you?
I think it made me appreciate what I had because I noticed how some children were treated and they weren't all treated the same way that I was being treated. I was always treated like I was their child. And I could tell that other children weren't treated like they were someone's child. And that always kind of upset me. I think that's why, like, even now, I get so upset when I see like those foster care signs advertising, like, we need foster homes for money, like advertising for money, because it just really triggers something in me, like that experience of like seeing kids and knowing that they were not treated with the best experience or with the love and respect that they always deserved, because sometimes it was just for monetary purposes.
Tell me a bit about the O'Neill family.
So the Anil family was a family that adopted a bunch of kids from the agency. It was like a really good firsthand experience of how this can sometimes work to a disadvantage. I won't say that every child that went through this family wasn't treated with love and respect, but I know that a lot of them didn't feel that way. I know that they didn't. And it was hard to kind of watch them go through experiencing the things that they did. And like one thing sticks out in my mind. Like I remember seeing one of the children and I asked her like why she looked unhappy. And the mother kind of like snapped at me and she was like, "It's nothing wrong with her." And she was just really nasty about it. And I was like, I'm just trying to show like her some love. Like she seems unhappy. Like like I care about her and I just want to know like how I can help. But it was like even just asking her something like that was like frowned upon.
If you could sort of give me a ballpark number, an estimate of how many children had experiences with the O'Neill family, do you have one?
It was like 10, and I don't know if they were all adopted or if they were adopted and fostered, because I feel like there were some that came later. So there may have been more, but it was just it was a lot, like to the point that they had to go out and get like a van to carry them and transport them all.
So some of these kids were adopted, but they were also adopted at an older age, correct?
Yes.
Tell me a bit about the names of these kids.
That was also like a really interesting thing because although they were older and they were adopted, they changed their names. They were like 10 or 12 years old when they were being like adopted and their names were being changed. And that was not what they wanted. It's not like they chose these names. they were names that were then being forced upon them. So it was really weird to like one day call them by like their birth name. And then the next day we had to call them like their adoptive name. It's like if you didn't call them by their adoptive name, the mom would kind of fuss at you and kind of snap at you and say, like, don't call them that. That's not their name. But like in secret, we would kind of sneak and call them, like their birth name. Like, we would just kind of sneak around and say. And it was kind of like our way of like, I see you, I respect you. Like, I kind of think about it as like now, like inclusive practices, like we try to call people by the name that they choose. And they were choosing their birth name, but that was not the name that they were being publicly allowed to be called. I never really knew what to make of it, especially as a child going through it. But I know like now as adults, many of them have gone back to their birth name.
I really just couldn't imagine it. Like I went into care when I was 16, but if I went in when I was like 10 and got adopted and someone said, "Hey, your name is no longer Serena, it's whatever name they chose," I don't know how I would react to my first name just being changed like that. It feels depersonalizing to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's how I imagine it to be. And again, that hasn't been, my experience, but I assume that that's how they felt based on like us kind of doing that in secret and then them as adults going back to kind of their birth name.
So the O'Neill family had biological children too, right?
Yes. They had like two.
Did you ever notice a difference between the way that their biological children were treated versus the ones who were adopted?
Of course. I mean, they had all the things that they kind of wanted, and it was never really a question. But when it came to the other children, like there was the hesitation between why do you want this? What are you asking for? And the attitude. Like it was always just a very different attitude. Looking back on like that and kind of processing like what you see as a child, it was just a really messed up situation. You don't really know the words for it when you're that age because I was the same age as them and I was going through it. They didn't have the words for it and they were experiencing it. But it was really like my introduction to like I don't think this is what this is supposed to be. This is how you shouldn't treat foster or adoptive kids. And this is different than how my family treats me, but why? Oftentimes they appeared sadder than the biological children. Looking at them now, they're in different places. And I have to believe that that's part of like the love and nurturing that they kind of received.
Do you have any sort of specific memories of going and visiting the O'Neills? Like any specific story that sticks out to you that sort of illustrates what you've been saying?
I would come over to play and I would begin to play with a lot of times the adopted children. I would just play with them. Like we'd all just kind of run around and play. And they had like this kind of playroom in the basement. I remember her kind of like, why don't you just come back upstairs with the girls, like the other girl? And I was like, well, no, I like want to stay down here with them. Like the toys are down here. I'll play with them. And she's like, no, why don't you come back up here with her? A lot of times I could see how the mom would kind of push me to kind of play with the biological children instead of like the adopted children. Like it was always like this kind of separation. And it got different like as they got older. And some of them kind of gravitated towards staying kind of together with each other. And then like, I guess assimilating into like the family culture. I mean, I think even now there's still this divide between them. And it's kind of really divided between like the adopted children that really assimilated into the family and really took hold of like that adopted name. And then those that have like chosen to stick with like their biological name.
I think something that's really interesting with what you've just said is that you have you and a good example of how adoption is supposed to work and the love that it can bring to somebody. And then another example of how it can sort of be something that it's not supposed to be. It can be something that's bad for someone who is growing up.
Yeah, it definitely is. You can see kind of the back door of it, the inner workings of it. And I really think that that was kind of like the basis or the foundation of like the work that I kind of do and getting my start in even social work, and working with children and families.
So, as you got older and you were a teenager, you got curious about your biological family. Tell me about that.
Um, and I really say it started with that really biology class, and learning about genetics. You start doing like those little Punnett squares and trying to figure out like recessive genes. And I'm like, I have no idea. I remember being in class and they would say, what color is your mom's hair and what color is your dad's hair? You have to put in these squares and that's, make these things up. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I can say black. Uh, let's assume black. I don't know. Or going to the doctor and they ask you for your medical history. And I say, I don't know. I'm adopted. And I became curious. What have they passed on to me that I don't know about? There was limited information that they were given because the source was coming from a 14-year-old and she didn't know a whole lot. And so they weren't given a lot of information in my adoption records. So when I became, I believe, 18 or might have been 21, I decided to go ahead and petition the court for my adoptive records. And I was granted those records. And so I started to look through those records. I thought it was interesting that the signature on the adoption record wasn't my grandmother. It wasn't my maternal grandmother. I didn't have any paternal information, but I was really curious about that just kind of random person that signed it as kind of the guardian. And so I reached out to, there's like a agency, I believe they're like Angels of Kentucky, that will help you kind of look into your adoption stuff and see what they can find. And they could only find like one number. And so, I'm talking with my mom and I'm like, well, I've got this record. I'm showing her all the stuff. And I'm like, I don't really know what to make of it. And, at the time, I don't really know how nervous that she is. She's really playing it cool and collected. And she's really holding it together and she's being very supportive. And when the Kentucky Angel people come back, they have this one number. And she's like, well, why don't you just call it? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm really nervous. And she's like, just call the number. Call the number. And it's like fast food restaurant. I think it was like a Wendy's or Hardee's number. So, I was like, oh, well, oh, well. They did have some pictures, like some, I guess like some Google images of some houses that she lived in and just like some random information about her. So, I was a little disappointed. And then my mother confesses that, she's always been afraid that she's going to lose me, that this woman is going to come back into my life and, she's my mother. How can she compete with that? Which, really shocked me because I'm like, no, like, you're my mother. You have nothing to be worried about. You've raised me, you've loved me, you've cared for me. When I was sick, you were the person that was there. Like, you are all that I know. I don't know this person and I don't know what I'm going to find. And, she can't replace you. And so, that made her feel good. But, it was just like, I don't know. Do I want to know her? Like, so one day I just like got on like Google and like just Googled her name. I was like, I'm gonna be like them on Catfish, and I am going to hunt people down. Like, let's just do it. And I was like, yes, like Google, and I found her on like MySpace or like her old MySpace, and then like her Facebook, and so I friended her on Facebook. But I mean, what do you say to somebody, um, in that situation? So I didn't say anything at all. I just sent a friend request and then like said nothing and just kind of like looked at her information. I found out that she had more kids. The oldest one she had like a year after I was born. So I was like, I don't really know how I feel about that. And that brought up lots of questions and feelings for me on that regard. And then eventually I reached out to her through like a messenger and was like, don't know if you know who I am, but I think you had a child back in like 1982, and I'm that child. Very awkward. I don't know what to say. And she responded and she was like, I thought that was you. And she's like, I didn't want to say anything, but I was just gonna wait for you to say something to see if it was. I'm glad you responded. And so, it was my opportunity like to ask the questions, like who's my dad and what is with this random person on my birth certificate? What happened? And so she starts to tell me about her being that her mom kicked her out when she found out she was pregnant, and that she was placed in this home. And that's kind of how I got that information. She gives me my dad's name, and she's like, I don't think he's on Facebook, but his sister was. She told me that he didn't know about me, and he was slightly older. He was her brother's best friend. And he was like 2 years older, not like super old, but slightly older. And so, hard question. You had a kid like a year later. Why did you keep that kid? And she was like, I'm gonna be honest. She's like, I didn't know what to do with you, and where like I thought I could go back home, and I didn't want to stay in foster care, and I thought that was the best thing for me to do. And she's like, I've wondered all these years if that was the best thing for me to do. And I was like, well, it really was. Like, I appreciate it. Like, if this is my opportunity to say thank you, then let me say thank you. I don't want you to second guess your decision, because I do believe wholeheartedly that the people that you chose made me into the person that I am today. And I don't think I would be the same person that I am had it not been for them. And not just my parents, but my grandparents, my uncles and aunts, like my tribe of people that came around me and wrapped around me and showed me love and care and support, and nurtured me until this day. And she was like, that makes me feel so much better. She offered to meet me, like if I was interested, and I have not taken her up on meeting her, because I still don't know how I felt. And looking at her pictures, I think, had I seen myself in her, I think I would have been more inclined to meet her. But that thing that I was searching for when I was a teenager, I didn't find. That thing I had been looking for, aside from like maybe my hair color, my complexion, but like who I look like and person I am, it made me realize that this that I have in front of me is because of the people that I have in my corner. It just really solidified that love and that support that I have from my parents.
Your biological half siblings. How many are there, and tell me about them?
No, I believe there are like five of them. I think all except for maybe the youngest were aware of me, and not their whole entire lives. And there's a funny story about it, because the oldest, he found out in a really weird way. So he's older, and he's with his now wife. And on some day or something, she shared something on like Facebook about the second child, and tags him, and she's like, haha, this is you. And his wife goes, what do you mean second child? And she's like, yeah, because he's my second child. And she's like, what do you mean? Where's this other child? And so she's like, yeah, like I had another child. I gave her up for adoption. So I mean, they found out kind of that way. So I reached out on Facebook and like friended him and like had a conversation with him. And then the second oldest daughter, friends with her on Facebook. They seemingly had a difficult life or had struggles. They apparently went in and out of foster care too, which also, kind of lets me know that it was the right decision. I think she struggled early on. I mean, she was still a very young mother, whether she was 15 or 16 years old when she had them. They had their difficulties with her and have, had to overcome some things with her. He encouraged me to go ahead and meet her and that she's a better person for all the things that she's kind of gone through. So, I mean, again, I'm still open. I'm just very slow at it. It's been very difficult because he's been very like, yeah, like sis, like I'm gonna call you sis. And I'm like, my entire life I've been an only child and I don't know how to respond. I haven't had like siblings, so I don't know. Like that's a different realm for me. Not only do I have half siblings from her, but a large group of half siblings from my father as well.
So in 2018, you get your master's from the Kent School of Social Work at the University of Louisville. You apply for jobs and you get accepted for a position with CPS. Tell me what that was like.
That was an experience. That was probably one of the hardest decisions I had to make. I had like three different job opportunities and choosing which one I was going to take. I didn't want to start my career off wrong, but I also, wanted to make the right decision for myself and my family and make the most impact. I had the opportunity to work for CPS, but as I started to think about that decision, I really knew that that was not the right decision for me. And I was talking with my mom about it. And I told her that I'm offered a position with CPS. And she's like, I don't think you're gonna be able to do that job. And I'm like, why? And she's like, do you remember when you watched the movie Dumbo? And I'm like, yes. And she's like, do you remember what happened when you watched Dumbo? And she's like, specifically the part where Dumbo goes and they like taking Dumbo away from his mom. And I'm like, oh, I cry. And she's like, what do you think is going to happen when you have to take a kid away from their mom? And I'm like, you're right. Dumbo is the reason I can't take a kid away from its mother. And I think about that constantly. When I watch Dumbo, I cry. When I watch them take Dumbo from his mom, for me, that is much like CPS coming in and taking a kid from its mom. And the process is not very different even when it's warranted. It's still a dramatic process, and no child wants to leave that parent. And so the parent's crying, and the child is crying, and it's just a very emotional scene. And as an empathetic person, I want to cry. I can't do my job if I'm crying. And I want to leave that child and I want to wrap around them and support them. Because in my mind, we need to be providing services to prevent that from happening. Now, again, if that's warranted, if there's something that's happening that we need to remove that child, then that's one thing. But in most cases, that's not the case that's happening. There are things that could be done to prevent that from happening, or it doesn't actually need to happen. I've seen it from many cases that I worked with in CASA. And so I knew that CPS was not going to be the right fit. And I'm glad my mom reminded me of Dumbo.
So from there, you make a pivot in your career. Tell me about it.
So I decided to work for CASA instead of CPS. So on the other side of that coin, I want to protect children and their families. I want to be the voice for a child. If they deserve to still be in the home, I want to say, yes, let's keep this child in the home, and this is how we can do that. I want to be able to support these families and helping them throughout their CPS cases. And so I decided to take that position instead. And so, as an advocacy supervisor, I was appointed to two different courts, and I would go and sit in that court basically all day and listen to all of the CPS cases. It was lots of heavy material, but I would be there with the attorneys, conferencing the material with the social worker, the guardian ad litem or the children's attorney, the parent's attorney, and then we would go before the judge and speak. Oftentimes we would have to prepare reports for the judge, and the judge would ask me my opinion if I thought CASA would be a good fit for cases. I appreciated the opportunity to do that job because I hold that job in a high regard. It's a much needed job, and they rely on volunteers to go out and see the children, and then I oversee like those volunteers and make sure that court is able to run smoothly and that things are done to the court standard.
Tell me a bit about what CASA is.
It's an advocacy organization that acts as the voice for the child. So in many instances, children are not allowed in the court when they are put in the child protective systems when something happens. So if they get a CPS case, oftentimes children are not allowed into the court, although they are very much involved and it is all about them. They mostly don't get to have a say in what happens with them. And so CASA is there to say, let's make sure that children do have a say. Let's make sure that their best interest is heard and that we can serve their best interest and make sure that they are taken care of.
What was it sort of like to be in court and hear these child abuse cases?
It was heavy. You are hearing day in and day out some of the worst things that are happening to children. You don't hear all of the reports that are happening, not all of the child abuse reports, but the ones that are making it to court. But a lot of it was just really heavy. So a lot of secondary trauma because you're absorbing all of that information. And it would be case after case after case after case every day.
Sort of paint a picture for me of who's in the court with you and who might not be in the court with you.
Family court is a very interesting dynamic. It doesn't necessarily go the way that you think it should go. Most cases are really figured out before they actually make it into court. So essentially, parents or families or caregivers are waiting in the lobby behind the court doors. And then between that door and the court door is usually a conference area where the attorneys, social workers, and anyone else that may be assigned to a case are conferencing, what they call conferencing cases. And this is where everything is really decided on a case. And so you'll have a social worker, you'll have the attorneys. And so everyone on the case gets an attorney. So each parent or each caregiver gets an attorney. The child gets an attorney. And that's usually called a guardian ad litem or GAL. And then you have CASA if they're appointed a CASA. And so we're back behind those doors discussing what should happen on a case. And so usually that's whether parents have done what they're supposed to do. If we have a report, we're discussing what the children say and what they want the court to know. Oftentimes, no one has talked to the child except for the social worker and us, and that includes the child's attorney. Now, that may be different in your state, but I feel like that's kind of across the board how it happens. But in Kentucky, or at least in Jefferson County Family Court, oftentimes the guardian ad litems don't necessarily talk to the children unless it's a particular case and they have to talk to them. But we talk about whatever has happened between court cases, right? And then the county attorney will say, well, what do we want to happen at this court date? And write up some court orders. The parents' attorneys will take it out to the parents in the lobby and discuss it with them and say, are you in agreement with this? If the parent is not in agreement with it, then they'll give you a hearing. Sometimes that hearing is the same day, and sometimes it's not. But oftentimes the parents aren't even really getting a say. It's all really decided between those parties, between conferencing. And so that's what really family court kind of looks like. And I don't think that's really the ideal situation, but that's how it operates. That's what it looks like.
What do you think the ideal situation would be?
In a court system that should be based on the best interest of a child, I don't think the only people that should be talking to the child should be the social worker. And then if they have a CASA, CASA, because CASA is not assigned to every case. So if you don't have a CASA, the only person that's talking to the child really is the social worker. The GAL, they're getting paid to represent this child. So they should be talking to that child, as well as the parents' attorneys. They should really be seeing their clients before they get to court that day. But that's not what really happens.
So, over the 2 years you worked for CASA, how did you recover from seeing all of these child abuse cases? How did you sort of keep up with yourself and make sure that you were okay?
In the beginning, it was really difficult. I would come home and I would literally just kind of ball up in like a little ball and just kind of cry. I was hearing things that I did not think any child should experience. And then I sort of detached. You learn how to kind of separate things and just kind of those coping mechanisms, right? I would say as a social worker, it's really embedded in us about self-care. We are prone to secondary trauma in itself because of the nature of our work, whether you're a therapist or you're case managing or doing things like working with CASA, you're exposed to these types of situations on a consistent basis. And so you have to know like what works for you. And so for me, that looks like sometimes writing in silence, taking moments to kind of process and kind of put that out of my mind so that I can transition to home life. There's that work life and then there's home life. And I have to keep those two separate. So when I come home, I don't want to talk about work. I don't want to talk about that until I have to think about it again. I want to come home and I want to be able to enjoy my kids. I want to be able to, love them. But I would be lying if I didn't say there were times when I came home and I did not just hug my kids really tight. We would talk amongst each other at work. We would talk about our cases so that we could debrief with each other and kind of have someone to kind of bounce like those things off of while keeping like confidentiality.
What did your experience in CASA make you realize about the legal side of foster care?
I would sit in court day in and day out and watch these cases. And one, I would see a disproportionate amount of Black and Brown people coming into court. And I knew that that was wrong. A lot of times things weren't necessary to be in court. Again, they could have had some wraparound services and it would have been better served. Had they had check-ins or therapy or anything else, it would have been helpful to keep children out of care. I remember that there was one particular case. It was the nail in the coffin for me because it just really highlighted some really bad disparities. And in part because it was just wrong. And as much as I wanted to help, there was like nothing that I could do. In this particular case, we were not assigned. So CASA, the kids did not have CASA. And so I'm just a spectator. And essentially, it was a Black father, a white mother, biracial children that were placed with an older white couple that the mother met at a church. It was the weirdest situation. I'm not exactly sure how they got placed with these people, but once they got placed with them, they did not want to let the children go. The mother had used drugs, and I believe the father initially had, and there was some domestic violence instances with them, but he was doing what he had met all requirements. He did everything that the court had required of him. And then this placement, basically the foster care family, started making claims about him. So he was having visitation with his children. Well, he only one of the children was his, and it was the youngest child. He was meeting up with them and meeting up with them in public. He goes to meet up with them, and this foster dad starts saying that the dad is being very belligerent. He's yelling, he's cussing, he's scaring him. He saw what he did to the mother. He saw the pictures. But he claims that he is a former or retired sheriff or something, but he's scared. The judge believes him and basically starts to walk dad's rights back. So now he has like supervised visitations at a facility. And of course, the dad is like, that's not what happened. I did not do that. Yes, it was hot outside and I was frustrated because I shouldn't have to do this. Like, I've done all the things that I've done. I'm clean and I've been clean and I'm not doing anything with her. Just give me my child. He goes to the visitation center. At the visitation center, what happens when you go to visit, you're supposed to, whoever's dropping the kid off is supposed to drop them off 5 minutes early. The center's supposed to take that child. That person then leaves. The visitor comes in, visits with the person. They never see each other. Like, it's just that exchange. There's always like that 5-minute window of non-overlap. On this particular day, the visitation center was delayed. They weren't open. When the foster dad shows up, the center isn't open. The dad shows up at his scheduled time to pick up his daughter, and he's like, well, it's not open, but you're here. Why don't you just go ahead and give her to me? And he's like, oh my God, I am so scared, and starts running through the building frantically. And he's knocking on all of the doors and frantically calling like the supervision center people. And they finally get a hold and they're like, oh, well, she's running a little behind. She's on her way. And he's like, I'm scared for my life. And they're like, well, just get in. Well, I guess get in your car and leave. So he does, but he takes the little girl with him. So of course the dad's upset. He's like, what are you doing? Like, give me my child. So now the visitation center is like, we can't see you all anymore. The judge believes the foster dad. Dad ends up losing visitation rights. They end up having a hearing, and what should be returned to a parent, he ends up losing custody of his child because of the testimony of these foster parents, based on their testimony alone. While dad and his dad, so granddad of the child, both Black men, are sitting there like, like, this is ridiculous. This is basically racist. You're being racist at this moment because you're believing him and you're not believing us. We're trying to tell you what's happening. He's not scared. He's a retired sheriff or whatever he is. He has a gun. What is he scared of? My son? Like, what's he going to do? Son doesn't have a gun. He's never raised a hand to him. He's never done anything to him. And now he's lost custody of his child. Every Black person that was in that court that day, we all looked at each other. And I mean, we looked around, like our eyes were like wide and our mouths, like my mouth was open. I know it was. I couldn't hide my expression. I looked like the social workers from CPS. I turned and I looked at them and they were looking at me, and I look at the judge and I'm like, I look at the dad, the granddad, and all I could say to him was, I'm so sorry. By the next court date, the dad committed suicide.
Oh my God.
He went from believing that he was walking into court to get his child back to losing his child within like a month span.
And the child wasn't represented through all of this? They weren't asked questions?
It was a little baby. She was maybe 2. They had her for basically her first 2 years of her life. And all he wanted was his child. He did everything possible to get his child. And at that point, I'm like, this system is broken beyond repair. Because if you're telling parents that the whole point of court is to return children to their parents, That's not what happened. If you tell a parent, all you have to do is complete these court orders, go to therapy, do drug testing, do anger management, do the domestic violence training, do all of these things, and you do all of that. And you do the supervised visits, even though you don't need to be supervised with your child, and still lose custody of your child because they would rather believe this white man over this black man. There is no jury of your peers in family court. It is just the judge makes a decision. I mean, these foster people that came from whatever church had money, so they had a private attorney. That holds more weight. When you have a private attorney, you get pushed to the top of the line. You get to go first. You get to go at the head before everyone else. I mean, and I'm sitting near his dad, and I look at his dad, and his dad is just like, they wouldn't place the child with him. He's a relative, didn't consider him. So when we came back to court, and the judge like, where's dad at? And they said, he's no longer with us. And his dad said, you killed my son.
What happened after?
Basically nothing. I mean, case closed. He's deceased. What is there to do? There's no person left to challenge. When mom gets ready and she gets herself together and she's ready to try to get custody or whatever, then she can appeal. I came home and cried that day. There are a few days that I came home and actually like legit cried, but that was one. At that point, I didn't really know what else I was going to do or how I could do anything after that. You know, take a hard look. I mean, the writings were there. You know, I am a little Black woman going to court every day. And even though I am there every single day, they really didn't know my name. They would often confuse me with other people. Like, why are you here? What case are you on? Like, I'm not on any case. You know that. I'm CASA. I'm just here. I'm your CASA. I'm in this courtroom all the time. How could you forget? You know, you just kind of observe those things and you're like, you know what? I'm not making an impact, but how can I in this system? I'm going to do the best that I can on the cases that I can. I'm going to stand up and try to say what I can. So I don't want to be held in contempt and not be thrown in jail. So when I'm assigned to cases and I'm allowed to speak, you know, in that particular instance, I was not allowed. And so that's why I made the transition to policy work. I don't want to just help children and families on a smaller scale. Let me focus on these policies. The things that are really holding children and families back, I need to work on those things. We know that these policies, these systems are the real issue.
My heart goes out to that fucking girl. Like, what is she going to do when she grows up?
I'm sure she's going to have a lot of questions, and I don't know if she's going to have access to her biological family. I know her mom was heartbroken, but even by the end of it, the mom even lost custody of her. In mom's defense, she was not doing what she needed to do. She was not where she needed to be. So he was, but she was not.
My goodness.
And I mean, the speech that he gave, and it was the speech as he told him he was losing custody. I mean, this judge stood there sat there and just belittled and berailed him and told him he could not be this aggressive. And I mean, for me, it was like, you can't be this thug. There was nothing I could do, and I didn't. And being this spectator to this horrible event.
If you would like to reach out, please send an email to exfostervoice@gmail.com. If you'd like a question to be answered on the show, or just want to voice your opinion, send a short video attached to your email. What people do you think are good for CASA?
CASA needs all kinds of people. They really need people of color because that's usually the demographic that's lacking. But really, anyone who has a firm belief or care for children and has time and the energy. When you volunteer for CASA, you're usually appointed to one case, so it's not quite overwhelming. But if you want to help a child that needs someone to speak up on their behalf, definitely look into it. If you've got, an extra hour a week and maybe can take off a little bit during the week if you have like a court case, it's usually all it takes.
What do you think would help support adoptive kids?
I think more education, the way that they are doing adoption, it doesn't necessarily need to be like an adoption meal. Like, you pay some money and you get a child, but actually having trainings and informationals, how to support children that are adopted, providing them with some therapy, some family therapy, ways to connect with children, just really wrap around supportive services. And of course, giving it time. I think it is helpful if you foster a child and develop that relationship, and really get to know them and what they need. The more that you get to know what that child needs, the better able you are to support them.
You use this term wraparound services. For someone who might not know, what is that?
So wraparound services is really services that kind of go around a child and not just come at a child, right? So if you think of like therapy, that's one aspect of it. And so in addition to like mental health, maybe they have some learning disabilities and they need some assistance with that. So that's another wraparound service. You want to provide supports that support the child from every angle and not just one angle.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I think that your story really speaks to how important it is to have people who have been adopted work in the foster care system in some capacity. It's so important and it helps people be represented.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. And I completely agree. I don't know. I mean, I know it's not for everybody, but I'm here. We're going to keep pushing through, hard hitting all.